April 18, 1943, 9:34. M local time, somewhere over the Solomon Islands, the Pacific sun burning through the cockpit canopy of Major John Mitchell's P-38 Lightning. As he scanned the horizon at 18,000 feet, his 16 fighters spread across the sky in precise formation after flying more than 500 miles at wave-top altitude through radio silence, when suddenly Lieutenant Douglas Canning's voice cracked through the static with 3 words that would change the course of the Pacific War. "Bogies, 11 o'clock high," and Mitchell's eyes snapped to the position, catching the glint of sunlight on metal. 2 twin-engine bombers, escorted by 6 fighters, descending toward Bougainville, exactly where his meticulously calculated flight plan had predicted they would be, exactly 1 minute ahead of schedule, and in that instant every pilot in the formation understood that the most audacious targeted killing mission in military history was about to unfold. The lead bomber, a Mitsubishi G4M Betty painted green with grey undersides and marked with tail code 323, carried inside its cramped fuselage a 59-year-old Admiral whose death the United States government had decided was worth risking 16 fighters and their pilots, a man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, who commanded the entire combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, whose strategic genius had made him both the most respected and most hated military figure in the Pacific theater, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, and he was flying to his execution without knowing that American codebreakers had read his itinerary days earlier, and that the young pilots, now dropping their external fuel tanks and pushing their throttles forward, had been sent with a single, specific purpose: not to disrupt shipping or attack an airfield or provide cover for bombers, but to kill him, too. The mission that was about to reach its violent culmination had begun not with military planning, but with an intelligence breakthrough, with exhausted cryptanalysts working through the night in a basement in Hawaii, with a decision made at the highest levels of American government to assassinate an enemy commander, with a mathematical calculation of fuel consumption and intercept angles, with the kind of cold-blooded precision that war demands, but that would spark ethical debates lasting decades. The story of how America came to hunt Admiral Yamamoto begins 6 years earlier, in the late 1930s, when a naval officer born as Isoroku Takano in 1884 to a schoolteacher father in Nagaoka, Japan, who had been adopted into the Yamamoto family and taken their name, who had lost 2 fingers at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 fighting the Russians, who had studied at Harvard University and served as naval attaché in Washington, who spoke English fluently and loved American culture, who had traveled across the United States and understood American industrial capacity in a way few Japanese officers did, rose to command the combined fleet despite his private opposition to war with the United States. Yamamoto had opposed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, had argued strenuously that Japan could not win a prolonged war against America, had warned that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that guaranteed nothing. Yet when ordered to prepare for war, he had done so with the strategic brilliance that made him indispensable, conceiving the carrier strike on Pearl Harbor that he knew would be Japan's only chance to cripple American naval power before industrial might could be brought to bear. The December 7, 1941 attack that killed more than 2,000 Americans and sank or damaged 8 battleships had been Yamamoto's brainchild, a tactical masterpiece executed with devastating precision, but a strategic failure because the American carriers had been at sea and survived, and from that moment Yamamoto became the most wanted man in America, his name synonymous with treachery, his photograph published in newspapers with captions demanding vengeance. What Americans did not know, what could not be known in the heat of war, was that Yamamoto had opposed the very conflict he now commanded, that he was a complex figure caught between duty and conviction, a man who loved the country he was fighting and feared the war would destroy his own nation. In early 1943, as the Guadalcanal campaign ended in Japanese defeat and withdrawal, Yamamoto planned an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, partly to assess his air units after Operation Winego, a series of air strikes intended to slow the American advance, but primarily to boost morale among troops who had endured months of brutal fighting and devastating losses. The inspection tour itinerary, including precise departure times, arrival times, aircraft types and escort details, was transmitted in coded messages on April 13th and 14th, 1943, using the JN-25 naval cipher that the Japanese Navy considered unbreakable, messages that were intercepted by American listening stations scattered across the Pacific and immediately forwarded to the Navy's cryptanalytic centers for decryption. At Station Hypo, the cryptographic intelligence unit buried in the basement of the Navy Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers had been working around the clock for months, sleeping on cots, subsisting on coffee and sandwiches, staring at endless columns of 5-digit number groups, trying to find patterns in the Japanese naval codes. Rochefort, a brilliant and eccentric officer who wore a smoking jacket and slippers to work, who had assembled a team of linguists, mathematicians, and puzzle solvers who operated with almost no military discipline but produced intelligence of incalculable value, had led the effort that broke JN-25 in early 1942, providing the intelligence that allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his carriers to ambush the Japanese at Midway in June 1942, turning the tide of the Pacific War. The work was maddeningly difficult, requiring cryptanalysts to identify patterns in encrypted messages, compare thousands of intercepts, make educated guesses about meaning, slowly build a vocabulary of code groups, and the process was never complete because the Japanese modified and updated their codes constantly. Marine Major Alva Red Laswell, one of Station Hypo's most skilled cryptanalyst linguists, took the lead on decrypting the Yamamoto itinerary messages, working through the night of April 14th to 15, and by the following day had produced a complete translation that he delivered to Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's fleet intelligence officer. The decrypted message was extraordinary in its detail, specifying that Admiral Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 0600 on April 18th aboard a medium attack plane, escorted by 6 fighters, would arrive at Balalay Airfield near Bougainville at 0800, would then fly to the Shortland Islands, inspecting units at each location, and the precision of this intelligence immediately sparked discussion about whether it could be exploited. Commander Layton brought the intelligence to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who recognized immediately the opportunity and the dilemma, the chance to eliminate Japan's most capable naval commander, but also the risk of revealing that American codebreakers could read Japanese communications, a capability that provided strategic intelligence of immense value. The decision could not be made at fleet level. This required authorization from the highest levels of government, and the intelligence was transmitted to Washington, where it reached Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and ultimately President Franklin Roosevelt. The ethical and strategic questions were profound and troubling. Was targeting a specific individual for assassination consistent with American values and the laws of war? Would killing Yamamoto actually help the war effort or simply make him a martyr? Would the Japanese suspect their codes had been compromised and change their cipher systems, denying America the intelligence advantage that had proven decisive at Midway? The debate about whether killing enemy commanders constituted assassination, which was banned by American military tradition, or legitimate targeting of combatants, which was clearly legal under the laws of war, would continue for decades after the war. But in April 1943 the decision was made swiftly, Roosevelt approved the mission, the authorization was transmitted back to Nimitz in Hawaii, then to Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific area from his headquarters on New Caledonia, and finally to Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded air operations in the Solomon Islands from Guadalcanal. Mitcher assigned the mission to Major John Mitchell, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Squadron, who would lead fighters from the 12th, 339th, and 70th Fighter Squadrons, all part of the 347th Fighter Group flying P-38 Lightnings from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The P-38 Lightning was the only American fighter with sufficient range to reach the intercept point, a twin-boom, twin-engine aircraft powered by 2 Allison V1710 engines producing 1,475 horsepower each, capable of 414 miles per hour at altitude, with a normal combat range of 450 miles, but the target area was more than 400 miles from Guadalcanal, requiring the installation of external fuel tanks to extend the aircraft's endurance. The P-38's armament was concentrated in the nose, 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, a configuration that allowed accurate fire at ranges up to 1,000 yards, far greater than wing-mounted guns that converged at a specific distance, and this firepower had made the Lightning one of the most lethal fighters in the Pacific. Mitchell, a methodical and precise officer, spent the night of April 17th planning every detail of the mission, calculating fuel consumption rates at different altitudes and speeds, plotting a circuitous route that would avoid Japanese-occupied islands where coast watchers might spot the American fighters and radio a warning, determining the exact intercept point and timing needed to catch Yamamoto's flight as it descended toward Balale. The challenge was extraordinary, flying more than 400 miles over open ocean at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection, maintaining precise navigation without radio communication, arriving at a specific point at a specific time to intercept aircraft that would be visible for only minutes, engaging and destroying the target, and returning to Guadalcanal before running out of fuel. Mitchell calculated that 18 P-38s would be required, 4 designated as the killer flight that would engage the bombers directly, while the remaining 14 would climb to provide top cover against the expected Zero fighter escort. Each Lightning would carry 2 external fuel tanks, one standard 165-gallon tank under one wing, and one oversized 330-gallon tank under the other, more than doubling the normal fuel capacity, but creating asymmetric drag that would affect handling characteristics. Mitchell's navigation plan called for flying southwest over the ocean, well away from Japanese-held islands, then turning northwest toward Bougainville, climbing to altitude only at the last moment, the entire outbound leg to be flown in complete radio silence at altitudes no higher than 50 feet above the waves, using a new Navy compass to maintain course. The timing had to be perfect. Yamamoto's message stated he would arrive at Balale at 09:45. Mitchell calculated that intercepting the Japanese bombers 10 minutes before landing, as they descended over Bougainville, would catch them most vulnerable. Working backward from 09:35, he determined his fighters should depart Guadalcanal at 07:25. On the evening of April 17th, ground crews worked through the night fitting the external fuel tanks and performing final maintenance checks. Armourers loaded ammunition belts, mechanics adjusted engines, and the 18 pilots selected for the mission studied Mitchell's briefing, understanding that they were being sent to kill a specific man, the architect of Pearl Harbor, and that success would require flawless execution and considerable luck. April 18, 1943, dawned clear and hot over Guadalcanal, the morning sun already brutal at 0700 when the 18 P-38 pilots walked to their aircraft, wearing flight suits soaked with sweat before they even climbed into their cockpits, the weight of the mission evident in their tense faces and careful pre-flight checks. Admiral Mitchell stood at the end of Henderson Field's runway, watching as each Lightning, loaded with more than 3,000 pounds of fuel, lumbered down nearly the full 2,000 feet of coral surface before lifting into the air, the heavily loaded fighters barely able to gain altitude. Before the formation could even depart, one P-38 suffered a tire blowout during takeoff and had to abort, and once airborne, another pilot discovered he could not draw fuel from his external tanks and was forced to turn back, reducing the attack force to 16 fighters, and because both pilots who aborted were part of the killer flight, 2 pilots from the top cover group were reassigned. Mitchell led the remaining 16 fighters out to sea, descending to wavetop level, the ocean below them a vast blue emptiness, depth perception almost non-existent at such low altitude, the pilots maintaining formation by watching the aircraft ahead, trusting Mitchell's navigation completely, because one error in course calculation would mean missing the intercept and possibly running out of fuel over open ocean. For more than 2 hours they flew in radio silence, following Mitchell's precisely calculated course changes, the monotony of endless ocean broken only by occasional whitecaps, the tension building as they approached the target area, each pilot aware that they would have perhaps 10 minutes of fuel for combat before needing to turn for home. Meanwhile, 560 miles northwest at Rabaul on New Britain, Admiral Yamamoto and his staff boarded two G4M Betty bombers at exactly 0600, right on schedule. The lead aircraft, tail number 323, manufacture number 2656, a brand new bomber delivered from the Mitsubishi factory in Nagoya just weeks earlier, painted with standard green upper surfaces and grey undersides. Yamamoto, wearing his green field uniform and white gloves, carried his ceremonial katana, settling into his seat with the staff officers who would accompany him on the inspection tour. Rear Admiral Rokuro Takata, his fleet surgeon, Commander Kurio Toibana, his air staff officer, and Commander Noboru Fukusaki, his aide. A second Betty bomber carried Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, and additional staff officers, and both bombers were escorted by 6 A6M0 fighters from the 204th Air Group. The flight proceeded south over the Solomon Islands, following a route the pilots had flown dozens of times, and there was no reason for concern. American fighters from Guadalcanal did not have the range to reach this area, or so Japanese intelligence believed, and the tight formation droned through the morning sky toward Balal, the pilots unaware that they were flying directly into an ambush. At Oreid 34, Mitchell's P-38s reached the final waypoint of their approach and began climbing to altitude, splitting into their assigned groups, the killer flight led by Captain Tom Lanphier climbing to 15,000 feet, the top cover group led by Mitchell climbing to 18,000 feet. At exactly Uro 9:34, 1 minute ahead of Mitchell's calculated intercept time, Lieutenant Douglas Canning, known for having the keenest eyesight in the squadron, spotted aircraft at 11 o'clock high and broke radio silence to announce contact. Mitchell immediately ordered pilots to drop their external tanks and for the killer flight to attack, and chaos erupted as 16 P-38s and 6 Zeros manoeuvred for position while the two Betty bombers, suddenly aware they were under attack, attempted to evade. Lieutenant Besby Holmes, part of the killer flight, struggled to release his external tanks, which remained stubbornly attached despite his violent manoeuvring, and his wingman, Lieutenant Raymond Hine, stayed with him as he tried to shake the tanks loose, leaving only Captain Tom Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber to press the initial attack. The Zero escorts turned to engage, and Lanphier found himself in a turning fight with Japanese fighters, while Barber, seeing the lead Betty bomber descending toward the jungle at high speed attempting to escape, dove after it. What happened in the next 60 seconds would be debated for decades, with Lanphier claiming he broke free from the Zeros, caught the lead Betty bomber in his sights, and fired the burst that sent Yamamoto's aircraft spinning into the jungle, while Barber insisted he pursued the bomber alone, fired repeated bursts into its left engine and wing root, and watched it trail smoke before crashing into the trees. Barber's P-38 would return to Guadalcanal with extensive battle damage, 104 bullet holes from the dogfight with Zeros, while Lanphier's aircraft was relatively undamaged, lending credence to Barber's account that he had engaged Yamamoto's bomber while Lanphier fought the escorts. The second Betty bomber, carrying Admiral Ugaki and the staff officers, attempted to escape by flying low over the water, but was intercepted by other P-38s and crashed into the sea, Ugaki and 2 others surviving the crash with severe injuries, while the rest of the crew and passengers were killed. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, ending with both Betty bombers destroyed, 3 Zeros shot down, and 1 P-38 lost when Lieutenant Raymond Hine's damaged fighter crashed into the ocean during the fight, killing the pilot. The surviving P-38s, critically low on fuel after the combat and the long flight, turned southeast toward Guadalcanal, some pilots landing with fuel gauges reading empty, one fighter crashing on landing due to damage sustained in combat. Mitchell and his pilots reported destroying 2 bombers and several fighters, claiming success for the mission, but unable to confirm whether Yamamoto had been aboard the crashed aircraft or had somehow survived. The confirmation would come from the Japanese themselves, though it would take more than 24 hours for the story to emerge. On the morning of April 19th, a Japanese search and rescue team led by Army engineer Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Hamasuna fought through dense jungle to reach the crash site of Betty Bomber 323 in the rainforest near Moyla Point on Bougainville. What they found has become part of the legend of Yamamoto's death, though accounts vary, some describing the Admiral's body thrown clear of the wreckage, seated upright under a tree, his white-gloved hand grasping the hilt of his katana, his head bowed as if in thought, a peaceful end to a violent death. Other accounts suggest he remained in the aircraft, strapped into his seat, and the subsequent autopsy would reveal the clinical reality. Yamamoto had sustained 2 .50-caliber bullet wounds, one entering the back of his left shoulder, a second striking the left side of his lower jaw and exiting above his right eye, either wound likely fatal, death probably instantaneous, or nearly so. The recovery team carried Yamamoto's body and the remains of his staff through the jungle to the coast, where they were loaded aboard minesweeper W-15. An initial autopsy was performed aboard ship. Then the remains were transported to Buin on Bougainville, where on April 20th, Lieutenant Commander Tabuchi Jizaburo, the chief medical officer, conducted a full autopsy. On April 21st, Yamamoto's body was dressed in his uniform, placed in a cremation pit, doused with petrol, and cremated, some of his ashes buried at an unmarked grave at Buin, the remainder loaded aboard a G-4M Betty bomber on April 22nd, and flown to Rabaul, then transported to Truk aboard the battleship Musashi, finally arriving in Tokyo on May 3, 1943. The Japanese military, shocked and devastated by the loss of their most accomplished commander, initially concealed Yamamoto's death, desperately trying to assess the strategic implications and prevent a collapse of morale. The delay in announcing the death sparked rumors and speculation, with some officers suspecting the worst when Yamamoto failed to return from his inspection tour. But official confirmation did not come until May 21, 1943, more than a month after the mission, when the Japanese government finally announced that Admiral Yamamoto had died in combat, and the nation entered a period of mourning unprecedented since the death of Emperor Meiji's father. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Yamamoto had been seen as invincible, the strategic genius whose planning had delivered early victories. And if the Americans could reach and kill their most protected leader, what did that say about Japan's ability to defend itself or win the war? For the United States, the successful completion of Operation Vengeance, as the mission was later designated, represented a triumph of intelligence, planning, and execution, proof that American code-breaking capabilities were operational and effective, that long-range precision strikes were feasible, and that Japanese military leaders were vulnerable. The impact on American morale was significant, coming after months of brutal fighting in the Solomon Islands, offering revenge for Pearl Harbor, demonstrating that the architects of Japanese aggression would be held accountable. The question of whether to publicize the mission's success created another dilemma. Announcing the kill confirmed American ability to read Japanese codes, potentially prompting the Japanese to change their cipher systems and cutting off the flow of intelligence that had proven so valuable. The decision was made to remain silent about the code-breaking aspect, with official statements simply noting that American fighters on routine patrol had encountered and shot down enemy aircraft, and remarkably, the Japanese either did not suspect or did not act on suspicions that their codes had been compromised, continuing to use JN-25 variants for months after Yamamoto's death, providing continued intelligence to American commanders. The controversy over who actually shot down Yamamoto's aircraft began almost immediately and would consume the two primary claimants for the rest of their lives. Captain Tom Lanphier, the leader of the killer flight, returned from the mission claiming he had personally destroyed the lead bomber, and his account was initially accepted, Lanphier becoming famous as the man who shot down Yamamoto, giving interviews, writing magazine articles, receiving credit for one of the war's most significant aerial victories. Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lanphier's wingman, insisted from the beginning that he had pursued and shot down the lead bomber while Lanphier fought the Zero escorts, and Barber's more detailed account, supported by physical evidence, including the extensive battle damage to his P-38 and the accounts of other pilots in the formation, gradually gained credibility. The argument festered for decades, with Lanphier defending his version until his death in 1987, while Barber campaigned for recognition, collecting statements from other mission participants, hiring researchers to analyze the evidence, seeking official acknowledgement that he had fired the fatal shots. In 1991, 4 years after Lanfear's death, the Air Force conducted a formal investigation examining all available evidence, including combat reports, aircraft damage assessments, and witness testimonies, and concluded that Barber, not Lanfear, had shot down Yamamoto's aircraft. The official record was amended. Lanfear posthumously lost 1 kill credit, dropping his official total from 5 to 4 and costing him his ace status, while Barber was finally credited with Yamamoto's destruction, though by then both men were dead and the vindication came too late for Barber to enjoy. The controversy, bitter and consuming, illustrated how the personal stakes of combat, the desire for recognition and glory, could overshadow the larger strategic significance of the mission. What mattered less was which pilot fired the specific bullets that killed Yamamoto than the fact that American intelligence, planning, and combat execution had combined to eliminate Japan's most capable naval commander, fundamentally altering the course of the Pacific War. The strategic impact of Yamamoto's death extended far beyond the immediate loss of leadership, creating a void that could not be filled because no other Japanese admiral possessed his combination of strategic vision, understanding of carrier warfare, and political influence with the Naval General Staff. His replacement, Admiral Minachi Koga, would later acknowledge that there was only one Yamamoto and no one could replace him, and Japanese naval strategy after April 1943 never recovered the innovative edge that Yamamoto had provided. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the largest carrier battle in history, would see Japanese naval aviation essentially destroyed in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a disaster that would have been unthinkable under Yamamoto's command. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan's last major naval operation, was conducted with carriers used as decoys because they had no aircraft or trained pilots. The carrier force that had been the pride of the Imperial Navy reduced to bait, a tactical bankruptcy that Yamamoto would never have accepted. Beyond the purely military considerations, Yamamoto's death demonstrated to the Japanese military and civilian population that their leaders were not invincible, that American reach extended even to the most protected individuals, that the psychological as well as military balance had shifted irreversibly. The decision to target Yamamoto specifically, to plan and execute a mission with the sole purpose of killing an individual rather than attacking a military installation or formation, raised ethical and legal questions that military theorists and international lawyers continue to debate. The laws of war, codified in various conventions and traditions, generally prohibit assassination of political leaders, but clearly permit targeting military commanders in combat zones, and the question becomes whether Operation Vengeance constituted assassination or legitimate targeting. Legal scholars have noted that Yamamoto was in uniform, travelling to a forward combat zone, commanding active military operations, clearly a lawful military target under any reasonable interpretation of the laws of war. The ethical question is more nuanced, involving considerations of proportionality, military necessity, and the precedent established by targeting specific individuals rather than military formations. Proponents of the mission argued that killing Yamamoto was justified by military necessity, that his leadership capabilities made him a strategic asset whose elimination would materially weaken Japanese warfighting capability, that the mission was no different than attempting to kill any enemy commander encountered in combat. Critics suggested that the deliberate, planned nature of the killing, based on intercepted intelligence and executed with premeditation, crossed a line from combat into assassination, that targeting individuals rather than forces might lead to escalation and retaliation, that the precedent could be misused in future conflicts. The American military establishment decided the operation was justified, noting that Yamamoto was a combatant commander in a combat zone during wartime, that the mission used conventional military forces and weapons against a military target, that no deception or violation of diplomatic protocols was involved. Executive orders issued after the war prohibited American involvement in assassinations, but these orders generally exempted military targeting of combatants during wartime, and the Yamamoto mission has been consistently treated as an example of legitimate wartime targeting rather than assassination. For Major John Mitchell, who led the mission and whose precise navigation delivered the fighters to exactly the right place at exactly the right time, the successful completion of Operation Vengeance was the highlight of a distinguished career, though he would continue to fly combat missions through the end of the war. Mitchell received the Navy Cross for his leadership on the mission, the citation praising his exceptional leadership, meticulous planning, and precise execution that resulted in the destruction of enemy aircraft and dealt a significant blow to Japanese military leadership. He would eventually retire from the Air Force with the rank of colonel, having served his country with distinction, but he rarely spoke publicly about the Yamamoto mission, perhaps recognizing that the taking of life, even enemy life in wartime, even a commander responsible for Pearl Harbor, was not something to celebrate, but rather a duty performed. Lieutenant Rex Barber, whose pursuit and attack destroyed Yamamoto's bomber, would finish the war with 5 confirmed aerial victories, continue serving in the Air Force after the war, and spend decades trying to receive proper credit for the mission that defined his service. He died in 2001 at age 84, having finally received official recognition for shooting down Yamamoto, though the acknowledgement came so late that it provided little satisfaction. The other pilots who flew the mission would scatter after the war, returning to civilian life or continuing military careers, their names largely forgotten except by military historians and aviation enthusiasts who study the details of Operation Vengeance. The P-38 Lightning that made the mission possible, the only American fighter with sufficient range to reach the target area, would continue to serve throughout the Pacific War, eventually being credited with shooting down more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter, but gradually it would be replaced by newer designs, and by the 1950s most Lightnings had been scrapped or relegated to museums. The wreckage of Betty Bomber 323, the aircraft that carried Yamamoto to his death, remained in the Bougainville jungle where it crashed, gradually being consumed by tropical vegetation, visited by occasional war relic hunters and historians, the crash site eventually designated as historically significant and protected from souvenir collectors. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, known to Japanese crews as the Flying Lighter because of its tendency to burn when hit due to unprotected fuel tanks, had been brand new when it carried Yamamoto on his final flight, delivered from the factory in March 1943, and it had functioned perfectly until 50 caliber bullets shredded its structure and killed its occupants. The final photograph of Admiral Yamamoto, taken shortly before he boarded the bomber at Rabaul on the morning of April 18th, shows a stern-faced man in uniform, aging but still vigorous, unaware that he had hours to live, unaware that American codebreakers had read his schedule and 16 fighters were already in the air hunting him. The photograph, distributed after his death as part of the Japanese government's announcement, became an iconic image, the face of the man who planned Pearl Harbor, the strategist who had opposed war with America but had prosecuted it with brilliance once ordered to do so, the admiral who understood his nation was fighting a war it could not win, but fought anyway because duty demanded it. Yamamoto's legacy remains complex and contested, seen by Americans as the architect of Pearl Harbor and therefore deserving of whatever fate war brought him, seen by many Japanese as a tragic figure, a man who understood the futility of war with the United States, but was bound by honor and duty to carry out his government's orders. The broader context of Operation Vengeance places the mission within the Solomons Campaign, the grinding series of battles from August 1942 through early 1944 that saw American, Australian, and Allied forces progressively capture islands and establish bases, pushing the Japanese back toward their home islands. Guadalcanal, the base from which Mitchell's P-38s departed, had been secured after 6 months of brutal combat that saw naval battles, air raids, and ground fighting of extraordinary intensity, establishing American control of the southern Solomons and providing the airfield from which long-range missions could be flown. Operation I-Go, the Japanese air offensive that Yamamoto had launched in April 1943 and which prompted his inspection tour, had been intended to slow the American advance, but had instead demonstrated Japanese inability to achieve air superiority, the poorly trained replacement pilots suffering heavy losses against increasingly experienced American air crews. Yamamoto's decision to personally inspect forward air bases was motivated by his recognition that morale was deteriorating, that his air crews needed to see their commander sharing their dangers, but this decision, born of admirable leadership instincts, created the vulnerability that American intelligence exploited. The punctuality and predictability that Japanese military culture demanded, the precise timing and routing specified in Yamamoto's itinerary, the assumption that communications were secure, all contributed to creating a target that American planners could exploit. The irony that Yamamoto, who had pioneered carrier aviation and understood the importance of surprise and deception, fell victim to a meticulously planned ambush based on intercepted communications was not lost on historians who studied the mission. The technical achievement represented by Operation Vengeance should not be underestimated, flying 16 fighters more than 800 miles round trip, navigating over open ocean without radio communication, arriving at the intercept point within 1 minute of the calculated time, engaging and destroying the target aircraft, and returning to base with only 1 fighter lost to combat, was a remarkable demonstration of planning, navigation, and combat execution. Major Mitchell's navigation, performed with relatively primitive instruments and based on calculations of speed, time, and heading, delivered his fighters to exactly the right position at exactly the right time, a feat that would be impressive even with modern GPS but was extraordinary with 1943 technology. The P-38's performance, operating at the extreme limit of its range with heavy external fuel tanks, climbing to intercept altitude while managing fuel consumption, engaging in combat, and returning to base, demonstrated the aircraft's capability and versatility. The Japanese failure to provide adequate protection for Yamamoto, relying on only 6 Zero escorts for 2 bombers, carrying the combined fleet commander and his staff, suggested either confidence that American fighters could not reach the area or a fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities. The decision to fly the same route that had been used for other flights, at a scheduled time transmitted days in advance, without considering that communications might be compromised, reflected overconfidence in code security that would prove fatal. The cultural factors that led to Yamamoto's death extended beyond operational security, to include the Japanese emphasis on punctuality and routine, the Admiral departing Rabaul exactly on time, following the prescribed route, arriving at the destination area precisely as scheduled, creating a predictable pattern that American planners could exploit. The code-breaking effort that made Operation Vengeance possible represented one of the most significant intelligence achievements of the Pacific War, comparable in importance to the Midway intelligence that allowed Admiral Nimitz to ambush the Japanese carrier fleet in June 1942. Station Hypo's success in breaking JN-25 and maintaining the ability to read Japanese naval communications throughout 1942 and 1943 provided American commanders with intelligence that shaped strategy, enabled tactical victories, and ultimately contributed significantly to winning the Pacific War. Commander Joseph Rochefort, who led Station Hypo and assembled the team of brilliant cryptanalysts who broke the Japanese codes, would later be denied proper recognition during the war due to bureaucratic conflicts with Washington-based intelligence officials, would be transferred from Hawaii and denied the Distinguished Service Medal recommended by Admiral Nimitz, and would not receive full acknowledgement of his contributions until decades after the war. The institutional conflicts within American naval intelligence, with Station Hypo in Hawaii sometimes reaching different conclusions than OP-20G in Washington, created tensions that occasionally threatened the effectiveness of the code-breaking effort, but ultimately the quality of the intelligence produced by Rochefort's team proved its value. The decision to risk compromising code-breaking capabilities by using intercepted intelligence to target Yamamoto specifically was carefully considered, with senior officers recognizing that if the Japanese suspected their codes were broken, they might change cipher systems, denying America the intelligence that had proven so valuable. The risk was deemed acceptable because the opportunity to eliminate Yamamoto was so significant, and the decision proved correct when the Japanese continued using JN-25 variants after April 1943, apparently attributing Yamamoto's death to bad luck rather than compromised communications. The aftermath of Operation Vengeance saw the mission largely classified for the remainder of the war, with official announcements simply stating that American fighters had encountered and shot down Japanese bombers, without specifying that the target had been Yamamoto specifically, or that the intercept was based on decoded intelligence. The pilots who flew the mission were instructed not to discuss details, particularly the code-breaking aspect, and most complied with this directive for years after the war ended. The controversy between Lanphier and Barber over credit for the kill emerged publicly only after the war, when both men published accounts of the mission that differed in crucial details, sparking decades of argument. The mission's designation as Operation Vengeance was not applied until 1965, more than 2 decades after the event, when military historians began systematically naming previously undesignated operations. The strategic assessment of Yamamoto's death evolved over time, with immediate post-war analyses suggesting his loss had been devastating to Japanese naval operations, while later studies qualified this conclusion, noting that Japan's fundamental strategic situation, lack of resources, inadequate industrial capacity, and overwhelming American superiority would have led to defeat, regardless of Yamamoto's continued leadership. The consensus among military historians is that Yamamoto's death accelerated Japanese decline but did not fundamentally change the outcome of the war, that his replacement was less capable, but that even Yamamoto could not have overcome the material disadvantages Japan faced by mid-1943. The psychological and morale effects of the assassination were significant but difficult to quantify, with Japanese military and civilian populations shocked by the loss, but also increasingly resigned to eventual defeat as American offensives continued to capture territory and destroy Japanese forces. The ethical debate over targeted killing of military commanders, sparked by Operation Vengeance, has continued through subsequent conflicts, with legal scholars and military ethicists discussing whether modern precision weapons and intelligence capabilities make such operations more feasible, and whether they should be more or less acceptable than they were in World War II. The precedent established by the Yamamoto mission has been cited in discussions of modern targeted killing operations, including drone strikes against terrorist leaders and precision strikes against military commanders in various conflicts, with advocates noting that Yamamoto set a clear precedent for such operations, while critics argue that the context of World War II, a declared war between nation-states with uniformed military forces, differs significantly from modern asymmetric conflicts. The laws of armed conflict have evolved since 1943, with additional protocols and conventions addressing targeting decisions. But the fundamental principle that military commanders are legitimate targets during wartime remains accepted. The question of whether targeting should be based on rank or on the specific individual's contribution to enemy warfighting capability remains debated, with some arguing that Yamamoto was a legitimate target because of his strategic importance rather than simply because he was an admiral. The proportionality question, whether the benefit of killing Yamamoto justified the risks, including potential compromise of code breaking and the possibility of Japanese retaliation against American commanders, was answered affirmatively by the commanders who approved the mission, but historians continue to examine whether that calculation was correct. The personal stories of the men involved in Operation Vengeance illustrate the human dimension of what was fundamentally an assassination mission. Young pilots in their 20s who had trained to fly fighters and engage enemy aircraft, but who on April 18, 1943 were sent specifically to kill one man, a mission that combined the impersonal violence of aerial combat with the targeted nature of assassination. These pilots, including Lanphier, Barber, Mitchell, Holmes, Hine, and the others whose names appear in mission reports but not in history books, were ordinary Americans transformed by war into instruments of national policy, executing orders that had been approved at the highest levels of government. Lieutenant Raymond Hine, who died when his damaged P-38 crashed during the engagement, paid the ultimate price for the mission's success, his death a reminder that even one-sided victories in air combat involve real human cost. The Japanese aircrew aboard the 2 Betty bombers and the 6 Zero escorts were also men with families and futures, most killed in the brief, violent engagement, their names recorded in Japanese military records but largely unknown to Western historians. The complexity of Yamamoto himself, educated at Harvard, fluent in English, opposed to war with America, yet the architect of Pearl Harbor and the commander who prosecuted the war with brilliance and determination, reminds us that even enemies in war are humans operating under constraints of duty, honor, and national loyalty. The photograph of his body recovered from the jungle, the descriptions of his final position, the details of his wounds, these clinical facts document the end of a life that had shaped the course of history. April 18, 1943, represents multiple anniversaries. The date was exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid, when 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet attacked Tokyo and other Japanese cities, the first American air raid on the Japanese home islands, a mission that had shocked Japan and demonstrated American reach. The symbolic significance of launching Operation Vengeance on the anniversary of the Doolittle raid was intentional, connecting the 2 missions as examples of American willingness to strike at Japan regardless of distance or difficulty. April 18th is also the anniversary of Paul Revere's midnight ride in 1775, launching the American Revolution, and while this connection was not explicitly cited in mission planning, the date resonated with American historical consciousness. The mission's timing, coming less than a month after Yamamoto had launched Operation Winego, his final offensive operation, created a sense of immediate retaliation, answering Japanese airstrikes with a precisely targeted blow against their commander. The 16 P-38s that flew Operation Vengeance represented American industrial might, each aircraft a product of Lockheed's Burbank factory, powered by Allison engines, armed with Browning machine guns and Hispano cannons, maintained by trained ground crews, flown by pilots who had accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time, the entire system representing an investment in training, equipment, and logistics that Japan could not match. The mission's success validated American strategy in the Pacific, the decision to establish forward bases, to develop long-range aircraft, to invest in intelligence and code breaking, to train pilots extensively. All these elements combined to create the capability to strike at Japanese leadership. The mission's conclusion, with Mitchell leading his surviving fighters back to Guadalcanal after the engagement, pilots monitoring fuel gauges anxiously as they calculated whether they had enough fuel to reach base, represented the final uncertainty of an operation that had required precision at every stage. Some pilots landed with fuel gauges reading empty, having extracted every mile from their external tanks and internal fuel, the narrow margin between success and disaster illustrated by their fuel consumption. The landing of the fighters at Henderson Field, ground crews counting noses and confirming that only 1 aircraft had been lost, pilots climbing out of cockpits soaked with sweat and pumped with adrenaline, marked the end of the physical mission, but the beginning of the assessment process. Mitchell and his pilots were debriefed immediately, their accounts of the engagement recorded, claims of destroyed aircraft documented, and the question of whether Yamamoto had been aboard the shot-down bomber remained unanswered for days. The confirmation of Yamamoto's death came through intelligence channels, intercepts of Japanese communications referencing the Admiral's death, providing the answer, but also raising the question of whether the mission had been worth the planning, the risk, and Hein's death. The assessment of mission success evolved over subsequent months and years, with initial celebration giving way to more nuanced analysis of strategic impact, morale effects, and precedent establishment. The legacy of Operation Vengeance extends far beyond the immediate tactical result of shooting down 2 bombers and killing Japan's most capable naval commander, representing a demonstration of how intelligence, technology, planning, and execution combine to create strategic effects disproportionate to the forces employed. The mission validated the investment in signals intelligence and code breaking that had been ongoing since before Pearl Harbor, showing that reading enemy communications could produce actionable intelligence that directly affected military operations. The successful completion of an 800-mile round-trip precision strike mission with World War II technology foreshadowed the development of long-range strike capabilities that would become central to American military doctrine in subsequent decades. The controversy over credit for the kill, bitter and consuming as it became, reminds us that even in war, human ego and desire for recognition can overshadow larger purposes. The ethical questions raised by deliberately targeting a specific individual for killing remain relevant in modern warfare, where precision weapons and intelligence capabilities make such operations increasingly feasible. The human cost of the mission, measured not just in Lieutenant Hines' death, but in the toll that combat takes on all participants, the psychological weight of taking life, even enemy life in wartime, reminds us that there are no clean victories in war. The story that began at 9:34 a.m. on April 18, 1943, when Douglas Canning spotted bogies at 11 o'clock high, reached its violent conclusion less than 10 minutes later, when Betty Bomber 323 carrying Admiral Yamamoto crashed into the Bougainville jungle, but the effects rippled outward for months and years, changing the trajectory of the Pacific War, establishing precedents for targeted killing operations, demonstrating the value of signals intelligence, and creating a controversy over credit that would outlive all the participants. For Major John Mitchell, the satisfaction of having planned and led a mission that achieved its objective exactly as intended represented the culmination of professional skill and dedication. For Lieutenant Rex Barber, the frustration of having his kill claim disputed for decades overshadowed what should have been recognition as the pilot who eliminated America's most wanted enemy. For Admiral Yamamoto, death came swiftly in the jungle, ending a life that had encompassed duty and doubt, brilliance and tragedy, a man who opposed the war he helped prosecute, who understood his nation was doomed, yet fought with distinction until American bullets found him. The mission reminds us that war is ultimately about individuals, not abstractions, about young pilots who flew into combat not knowing if they would return, about an admiral who boarded an aircraft not knowing it would be his last flight, about code breakers who worked in basement offices breaking enemy ciphers, about commanders who made life and death decisions that rippled across the Pacific, and about the profound human cost of conflict, regardless of which side claims victory.